I'm Naomi, and for most of my life, I believed I was immune to being deceived, not because I thought I was smarter than everyone else, but because I spent a decade learning how to recognize lies, how to dismantle manipulation, and how to trap liars. In their own words, being an attorney teaches you that it's not always about what people say, but how they say it, the pauses, the hesitations, the careful choice of words. Those are the cracks where the truth leaks through. I had built a career out of uncovering deception, and yet the cruelest lie I ever encountered was the one I didn't see coming. She was 30 years old, living in a sleek apartment in the center of the city. I had a well-paying job at one of the most respected law firms, and I was on the partner track. I wore tailored suits, I negotiated six-figure settlements, I won cases that made headlines. I was everything I had dreamed of becoming, and still somewhere deep inside me there was a quiet ache, an emptiness that success couldn't quite fill. I had loved ones, but the kind that came and went like a storm. After a few years, I had convinced myself I didn't need it anymore. I told myself that love was a distraction, a liability for people who couldn't stand on their own. But then I met Daniel, and every wall I built started to crumble. We met at a fundraiser for legal aid. I was only there because my firm had sent me to network. Shake hands, smile for the cameras. Daniel was there as someone's plus one. I didn't even notice him at first, not until he handed me a glass of wine and made some dry comment about the absurdity of auctioning off golf outings in the name of justice. I laughed, maybe more than I should have. It had been a long week, and his timing was perfect. He wasn't pushy, he didn't try to impress me, he just asked questions and listened, really listened, and I found myself wanting to tell him things I usually kept to myself. He wasn't the kind of man I usually dated. He didn't wear a suit or talk about mergers and acquisitions. He ran a small but growing tech startup, something to do with cybersecurity. He was passionate about it and humble. He said he preferred working behind the scenes, letting his product speak for itself. He had a calm energy about him, the kind that made you feel safe and seem like nothing could shake him. It was disarming, and I didn't realize how much I needed that until I let him walk me to my car that night and gave him my number without thinking twice. What followed felt like a dream. Our first few dates were simple dinners, walks, conversations that stretched into the early hours of the morning. He didn't try to impress me with flashy gestures. He just showed up consistently and with genuine interest. He asked about my cases, not in a nosy way, but because he said he admired the way I handled difficult people. He said I was strong and that being around me made him want to be better. I felt seen in a way I hadn't in years. He made me laugh, made me feel feminine and powerful at the same time, and for the first time in a long time, I let myself believe that maybe love wasn't a distraction, maybe it was the one thing missing from my life. Daniel started spending more time at my place. He brought his toothbrush, then a drawer full of clothes, then a set of keys. I didn't even question it. It all happened so naturally, so slowly, that it felt like progression, not invasion. He cooked dinner on weekends. He massaged my shoulders after long depositions. He brought me coffee in bed. He was attentive, gentle. He made life feel softer, and I forgot what it was like to sleep alone. He said he liked that I was driven, that I didn't need him to complete me, and I liked that he didn't try to tame my ambition. My friends noticed the change. They said I was glowing. My colleagues teased me about smiling more than usual. Even my assistant commented that I wasn't snapping at people anymore. I told them I was just in a good place. I had no idea I was standing on the edge of a cliff. The first time he mentioned money, it was subtle. He was talking about a new client contract. He needed a short-term loan to finalize a software purchase. He said banks were being slow and that he'd pay me back in 2 weeks tops. I didn't even blink. I transferred the money that night. I didn't think of it as lending money. I thought of it as investing in us. What's mine is yours, right? Isn't that what Lovish paid me back on time, just like he said, with interest? He even brought flowers to thank me, and that made me trust him even more. Over the next few months, there were other requests, small ones, a signature on a lease document that needed a co-guarantor, a temporary use of my business credit card to close a vendor deal. It all seemed reasonable, and I never questioned it, because why would I? Daniel wasn't just my boyfriend, he was my partner, or so I thought. Then came the night I found a message on his laptop. I wasn't snooping, he had left it open, and I was just checking the weather, but the message popped up on the screen, a woman's name I didn't recognize, and a message that read, "Last night was amazing. I miss you already." My chest tightened. I wanted to believe it was a misunderstanding, maybe someone flirting with him, someone he didn't respond to. I clicked the thread, and what I found was a string of messages, photos, receipts of hotel bookings, details of a relationship that had clearly been going on for months. He didn't confront him right away. I needed to process it. I needed to figure out how the man I shared my life with had managed to live another life without me noticing, and as I started digging, I found more, not just evidence of infidelity, but bank transactions, loans in my name, documents I didn't remember signing, linked bank accounts, money that had been moved from my investments to his business accounts and then disappeared. The betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was financial and professional. He had forged my signature, used my trust to access my finances, and created a trail that could easily fall back on me if investigated. I was horrified, I was heartbroken, but more than that, I was humiliated. I had let a man into my life, into my home, into my heart, and he had used every piece of it against me. I spent 3 days in my apartment staring at the ceiling, thinking about every moment we had shared, trying to trace back the red flags I had ignored, the nights he said he was working late, the times he avoided answering his phone, the way he always said he didn't like talking about money because it made him uncomfortable. And I realized I hadn't been in love, I had been in denial. But I wasn't just a woman scorned, I was an attorney, and I knew how to build a case. I knew how to destroy someone legally, and I knew that revenge wasn't about yelling or crying or begging for closure. It was about control and strategy and timing, and I had all three backed up. Every file on his laptop, every message, every transfer. I hired a forensic accountant and traced every dollar he took. I contacted a few of the women he had messaged and found that I wasn't the only one he had scammed. I wasn't even the first. He had a pattern, and patterns are the beginning of evidence. He went to the police, but I didn't tell them everything, not yet. I needed him to think I was broken, needed him to believe I was still under his spell, and I played the role perfectly. I didn't change the locks, I didn't confront him. I pretended like I hadn't seen anything, like I was just tired and stressed from work, and he fell for it because people like him always do. They mistake kindness for weakness and silence for submission. But I wasn't silent. I was preparing. I was building a case piece by piece and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And as I watched him sleep next to me in my bed, pretending to be the man I once loved, I knew that soon, very soon, he would wake up in a very different reality, one where he would no longer have control, no more lies, no more schemes, just consequences and the cold steel of justice. Because I may have lost my heart to him, but he was about to lose everything. I didn't cry in it at first. When I read the messages on Daniel's laptop and saw the truth unravel in front of me like a badly written script, I felt nothing, no rage, no sadness, no tears, just silence. It was the kind of silence that settles when the world shifts under your feet and your brain tries to catch up with what your eyes already know, the kind of silence that screams louder than heartbreak. He closed the screen and sat there for a long time. The apartment was dark and still. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and my own breathing. I stared at the walls like they might tell me what to do next. He wanted to scream, to throw things, to wake him up and demand answers, but I didn't. I couldn't, because something deeper had taken over, something colder, more methodical. I opened a notebook from my desk and started writing every detail I could remember, dates, times, things he'd said, things I'd signed or transferred. I made a list of every financial decision we'd made together, or rather, every decision he had made and I had blindly trusted. It wasn't just the affair that shattered me, it was the depth of his deception. Money he borrowed that I never saw again, the documents he asked me to sign casually while we were cooking dinner, the way he started taking more interest in my firm's internal systems, pretending to ask questions just to learn. It was all calculated. Hadn't fallen in love with me, he had hunted me, was a target, not a partner. And the realization made my skin crawl. The next morning, I watched him get dressed for the day. He kissed my forehead like nothing had changed, like the man he was with her last night didn't exist. I smiled back like nothing had changed either, and let him walk out the door. The moment it clicked shut behind him, I moved fast. I called in sick at work, turned off my phone, and spent the entire day combing through my accounts, my emails. My flash had linked one of his businesses to my personal bank account under a shared transfer agreement. I vaguely remembered signing it one night after wine and pasta. He'd said it was to streamline expenses since we'd been living together. There was an investment account that had been drained over the last 4 months' money I had set aside for my future for the down payment on a house I was going to buy by myself. He had used my information to secure a line of credit and moved the funds through several shell accounts, all registered under different names, and it was brilliant. Really, if it hadn't been my life he was burning to the ground, I might have admired the strategy. That night, I couldn't sleep. I laid in bed beside him, listening to his breath, wondering how someone could lie so easily, so constantly, for so long. I started to notice everything: the way he never let his phone out of his sight, the moments he became defensive when I brought up finances or future plans, the subtle ways he redirected conversations when things got too personal. He was always so careful, but now that I knew the truth, I saw the cracks everywhere. He remembered one evening 2 months ago, he said he needed help registering a business entity in another state. He was frustrated and tired and said he didn't trust online platforms. He asked if I could file it for him since I had access to certain legal databases. I did it without thinking. I even used my work email. No, I realized that entity had been used to move funds and take out loans that never got paid. He had dragged my name, my profession, and my reputation into a scheme that was deep and layered, and if I didn't move carefully, it would ruin me. So I decided to become the woman he thought I was. I started small. I hired a private cybersecurity expert, someone I knew through a client, to discreetly look into Daniel's company systems. I didn't say why, just asked for an audit under the radar. A favor: he requested my firm's IT department to run a background check on my emails and accounts, citing a potential breach. I told them I suspected someone had accessed my system from an outside device and I needed confirmation. Every day I built more of the puzzle. I contacted my bank's fraud department and opened silent investigations. I requested copies of any documents tied to my signature and flagged suspicious activity. Kept all this to myself. I acted normal. I kissed Daniel goodnight, cooked dinner, answered his questions, smiled at his compliments, and nodded at his plants. Inside I was burning, but outside I was calm. I wasn't going to expose him with rage or confrontation. I was going to dismantle him the same way he dismantled me, silently and completely. Over the next few weeks, I pieced together everything he had done. He had stolen over $120,000 from my combined accounts, leveraged my credit to open lines for his shell businesses, and set up fallback escape plans under false names. She had women in 3 other cities and a pattern of romantic frauds stretching back 5 years. What made it worse was that he wasn't sloppy. He kept his tracks covered well enough that if I had gone to the police with half the information, I would have looked like the bitter girlfriend who co-signed too many forms out of love. But I wasn't bitter, I was buldingy. Consulted a friend of mine who specialized in financial crimes. Without revealing too much, I asked what the threshold was for federal attention. I asked about how to compile a fraud case, what documentation would be admissible, and what evidence would be circumstantial. I asked about timing and thresholds and jurisdiction. Then I began collecting names of his other victims. One of them, a woman in Chicago, had already tried to press charges a year ago, but her case was dismissed due to lack of proof. I found her through an online forum, and after an hour-long conversation, she agreed to send me everything she had. He mapped his movements, his aliases, his accounts. He found a property he had purchased under a fake name with money he stole from another woman and sold under another name through a forged power of attorney. He wasn't just preparing a case, I was constructing a net. A trap. Irony was almost poetic. He had picked me because I was a lawyer, and he thought that meant I'd be too proud to admit I'd been fooled, that I'd keep it quiet to protect my reputation. Had no idea that being a lawyer was exactly what made me dangerous. On night he came home earlier than expected. and saw papers scattered across my desk. He asked what I was working on. I smiled and told him I was researching a complex inheritance fraud. Cassia laughed and said I sounded too serious. Ladalai kissed him on the cheek and whispered that justice required focus. Had no idea I was talking about. Himi kept a second phone hidden behind a false panel in my closet where I stored all the files, all the recordings and screenshots. I didn't trust cloud storage, not for Thesi knew what I was doing. Wasn't just personal, it was professional, and I had to play it carefully. One mistake and he could vanish, take what was left and disappear, and I wouldn't let that happen. Penny wasn't going to let a man who smiled in my bed and stole from my life walk away untouched. This to me, so I waited and watched and prepared, knowing that soon everything he thought he controlled would slip through his fingers, and this time the silence wouldn't protect him, it would bury him. It started with the small things, not the dramatic kind of breaking, but the subtle unraveling of a life you thought was built on solid ground. My morning coffee tasted wrong, my clothes felt tighter, the walk to the office seemed longer than it had any right to be, and the silence in my apartment no longer felt peaceful, it felt haunted. Everything was the same, but nothing was the same. I still went to work, I still reviewed contracts, still showed up to court, still smiled at clients, but every step I took, every motion I made was covered by a layer of detachment, like I was watching someone else live my life from a distance. There were moments when I would look in the mirror and not recognize myself. I would stare into my own eyes and wonder how I had become this woman, the one who had let someone dismantle her piece by piece without even realizing. I wasn't broken yet, but I was cracking, and I could feel it in my bones. He stopped answering calls from friends. I made excuses for skipping dinners. I told them I was just busy with work, that I had a big case coming up, that I was tired, but the truth was I couldn't look at them without feeling the weight of my shame. The truth was I couldn't stand the idea of explaining what had happened. Kept telling myself I would be fine, that it was just a matter of time before the plan came together, before Daniel got what he deserved, but that didn't stop the anxiety that crawled under my skin every night, or the nightmares that made me wake up gasping in the dark. He couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat, I couldn't breathe deeply without feeling like the walls were closing in on me. The strength I had been clinging to began to rot from the inside out, and there were nights I sat on the floor of my bathroom with my arms wrapped around my knees, trying to remind myself that I was still in control, even when everything felt like it was falling. Apathy plan was working, the evidence was piling up, the web was tightening around him, and yet it didn't feel like victory, it felt like drowning, because no one warns you that revenge, even the smart kind, the careful kind, still takes pieces of you. With I would sit across from Daniel and smile when he talked about the future, pretend to be interested when he mentioned a possible vacation we could take together, while in the back of my mind I was imagining the moment he'd be arrested, imagining the look in his eyes when he realized that I had known for weeks. And still I hated myself for loving him even a little. I hated that part of me still wanted to believe that some version of what we had was real, that maybe he had loved me once, maybe it wasn't all lies. But that's the cruelty of emotional manipulation. It blurs the lines between affection and control. It poisons the memory until you can't tell which part was yours and which part was planted. One morning, I walked into my office and found a note on my desk from my assistant. It was nothing more than a reminder about a meeting, but the handwriting, the neat lines, the way she had written my name so carefully made me tear up. Locked my door, sat at my desk, and cried silently, not just because of what I had lost, but because I had forgotten what it felt like to be treated with basic care. Was unraveling, and no one could see it because I had trained myself to hide it too well. I began making small mistakes. I missed a deadline on a minor filing. I misread a clause in a contract. I forgot to return a client call. Me colleagues noticed, but no one said anything. They just assumed I was distracted by work, by the pressure, by life. No one imagined the woman who had held her ground in court against men twice her age and 3 times her arrogance was falling apart in her own home. Daniel remained oblivious, or at least pretended to be. He still cooked dinner, still kissed my shoulder, still asked how my day was. I wanted to hate him with the full weight of my being, but my anger was exhausted. My rage had burned through me, and left nothing but as she started to question everything. Was my plan really going to work? Would the authorities take it seriously? Would he somehow twist it all back on me? What if I missed something? What if I failed again? Doubt is a vicious thing. It doesn't whisper, it screams, and it screamed all night long. And then one night, I was sitting in bed reading through more documents. My second phone opened next to me, and suddenly I couldn't breathe. I felt like the room was spinning, like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. He stumbled to the bathroom, turned on the faucet, and splashed cold water on my face, but it didn't help. I looked up into the mirror and saw a stranger, wide-eyed, trembling, and Halawi sank to the floor, and for the first time in years, I sobbed, not out of grief but out of sheer exhaustion. I cried for the woman I used to be, the one who believed that hard work protected you from harm, the one who believed that love made you stronger, not stupidity. Cried until my face was numb and my hands were cold against the tile. When it was over, when the last tear fell and the silence returned, I made a decision: no more cracks, no more fear, no more pretending. I had spent enough time grieving. I had mourned the loss of my heart and my trust and my peace. Now I was ready to finish what I had started. He got up the next morning and made a list of every remaining task, every name I needed to contact, every agency I needed to prepare. I triple-checked every file, backed up every folder, printed hard copies, and placed them in a secure deposit box at the bank. He reached out to a federal contact I had met during a previous case and asked for a discreet conversation. I laid out the structure of what I had discovered without naming names, and he listened. He took notes, and when I finished, he looked at me and said, "If what you're saying is accurate, this could lead to a criminal investigation." It was the first time I felt like I had a solid foundation beneath me. Againi returned home that evening and looked at Daniel like a puzzle I had already solved. There was no anger left, just calculation. Asked if I wanted to watch a movie. I said sure. He offered wine. I declined. He didn't notice. He never noticed the small shifts, but I did, and I knew the collapse he had caused in my life was about to become the collapse of his own. All I had to do now was wait, because the storm wasn't Kominji, was the storm. There is a moment when fear changes shape, when it no longer controls you but fuels you. I reached that moment the morning I locked the deposit box and walked out of the bank. The sky was gray, the air was sharp, and I felt something inside me shift. It wasn't confidence, not yet, but it was something close to clarity, a hard edge that cut through the noise of everything I had been feeling. The grief, the rage, the shame, all of it melted into something colder, more precise. I didn't want revenge. I wanted resolution. I didn't want to hurt Daniel. I wanted him to understand the consequences of his choices, not just the legal ones, but the kind that leave permanent scars, the kind that remind you who you decided to become. The shift began in my mind but quickly bled into my movements. I started walking with intention, speaking more clearly, managing my time with brutal efficiency. I returned to work and began tying up loose ends. Cases I had delayed were closed, files I had neglected were cleaned out. I was reclaiming control piece by piece, and no one asked questions because they were used to seeing me in control again. The only difference now was that I wasn't faking it anymore. At home, I maintained the act. Daniel still moved through the apartment like a man who had nothing to fear. He still used my kitchen, my couch, my bed. He still made jokes over breakfast and kissed me before he left for the day, but I was watching him differently now, not as a lover or a victim, but as a case. As a file I was preparing for trial. I documented everything. Every time he logged into his laptop, every name he mentioned on the phone, every receipt he threw away. I knew how to build a timeline, and I was building one with the kind of detail only someone like me could construct. On evening, he told me he might have to travel for a week to handle a new contract. I nodded, pretended to be disappointed, and told him I'd miss him. What I actually did was notify the contact I had spoken with at the agency and gave them the potential travel dates along with everything I had uncovered since our last conversation. The response was direct: "We're almost ready, wait for confirmation." That same night, after Daniel fell asleep, I opened his briefcase. While wearing gloves, I wasn't looking for anything specific. I just needed to know if there were documents he was keeping off his computer. What I found was even better than I expected: 3 contracts forged in different names, all tied to business entities I had already traced. All of them carried signatures that weren't his. All of them carried my firm's client ID number. I photographed everything carefully, returned each paper to its exact place, and sealed the briefcase shut again. My hands weren't shaking anymore, they were steady. Cleany scheduled a coffee with one of the firm's senior partners and mentioned casually that I might be taking some personal time soon. I framed it as burnout, exhaustion from a difficult quarter. He offered to approve 2 weeks off immediately, no questions asked. He said I deserved it, and for the first time in months, I felt seen again, not as a woman unraveling, but as a woman preparing for worth. Morning, Daniel was supposed to fly. I packed his suitcase for him. He joked that I was spoiling him, and I smiled, kissed his cheek, and told him to be safe. When he walked out the door, I stood at the window and watched the street until his car disappeared from view. Then I picked up my phone and made the call. He's in transit now, I said. The voice on the other end was calm. We'll take it from here. Wait for contact, do not engage. I spent the next 3 hours cleaning the apartment, not because it was dirty, but because I needed something to do, something mindless, something physical, while my mind raced with every possibility. Would he notice the investigation? Would he sense that the walls were closing, and would he run? Would they catch him? What if he was gone by the time they reached him? What if it had all been for nothing? But by midday I got the message they had him at the airport. He had triggered a federal flag. When checking in under one of his alternate identities, a team had been dispatched. He was taken into custody quietly without incident. I sat down on the floor of my kitchen and stared at the tile. My hands didn't move. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just breathed slowly, deeply, like someone who had been holding their breath for months. That night, I slept for the first time without waking up in a panic. The nightmares were gone, replaced by something quiet, something resembling peace. I knew this wasn't over. There would be court hearings, there would be questions and headlines, and possibly consequences for my own involvement, no matter how unintentional. But I also knew I had done the right thing, not just for me, but for every woman who had been used by him before me, and everyone he would have hurt after. Next morning, I called my parents and told them I was taking a break from the city. I didn't go into details, but my mother's voice softened in a way that told me she understood more than I had said. I packed a small bag, left a note for the building manager, and disappeared to a quiet rental by the coast, a place where I could breathe, where I could write, where I could think. He didn't check the news. I didn't answer emails. I turned off every notification and let the silence heal me in small, gentle ways. I took walks without purpose. I watched the ocean. I made tea. I read novels I hadn't touched in years. I let myself be still, not out of defeat, but out of recovery. And as the days passed, I began writing again, not about Daniel, not about the case, but about myself, who I had been, who I had become, and who I still wanted to be. I wrote letters I never sent. I forgave myself on paper. I allowed my heart to speak without fear of judgment, and somewhere in those pages I found her again, the Naomi I thought I had lost, the one who used to believe that truth mattered and that strength could come from softness. He didn't know what the next phase of this story would be. I didn't know if the courts would convict him or if he'd find a way to talk his way out. Didn't know if the money would be recovered or if I'd spend the next 5 years rebuilding what he had taken. But I did know this: the shift was real, and it was mine. I had transformed, not into someone colder, but someone wiser, someone more dangerous, not because I had learned to lie, but because I had learned how to see through every single one. And when the time came to return, when the hearings began, when the media called and the questions came, I would walk back into that courtroom not as a victim, but as the woman who turned betrayal into power and silence into strategy, because Daniel had underestimated me, and that was his first and final mistake. When you spend enough time with liars, you begin to understand their rhythms, the way they build stories, stitch half-truths into facts, repeat the same phrases until they believe them themselves. I knew Daniel was preparing a story. I knew he would walk into that courtroom with a carefully constructed narrative, something he'd rehearsed while smiling in my face for months. And I also knew that it wouldn't matter, because I had written the ending. The day I returned to the city, the sky was the same dull gray it had been when this began, but something inside me had changed. I was no longer walking in fear. I was walking in focus, every step measured, every breath deliberate. I went straight to my firm to meet with senior partners, not About my cases, not about leave, not even about Daniel. I was there to resign, not out of shame but out of choice, because the next part of this journey required full attention and no distractions. They didn't ask many questions, they had heard whispers. Enough to know that something had happened, something personal, something serious. They wished me well, and I left the building where I had built my career without looking back. That evening, I met with the federal investigators face to face for the first time. I handed over everything, all the files, physical and digital, dates, locations, account numbers, names of women and banks and LLCs. My voice didn't shake when I spoke, my hands didn't sweat. I told them what Daniel had done, not as a scorned woman but as a legal mind presenting an airtight case. They listened, they asked questions, and by the time I left the room I saw it in their eyes. They believed me. The arraignment was quiet. Daniel stood in the courtroom wearing a borrowed suit, looking smaller than I remembered. The charm was gone, replaced by tension. He pled not guilty, of course, and his attorney tried to paint the picture I had anticipated: a relationship gone wrong, a woman who had given too much and then tried to take it back, a misunderstanding of accounts and agreements. But I had anticipated every angle, every weak point in his defense, every attempt to blur the lines. Over the following weeks I met with prosecutors, provided sworn statements, verified timelines, matched transfers with document dates. Everything lined up. The paper trail was irrefutable, and it wasn't just mine anymore. There were 5 other women now, each with stories that echoed my own, and though we had never met, we had all lived through the same illusion of love. He was called to testify in the pretrial hearings, and when I stepped onto the stand, the room went silent. I looked at Daniel, but he didn't meet my eyes. He looked down at the table, his hands folded, his jaw tight. I told my story plainly, professionally, without theatrics, without bitterness. He explained the transactions, the forged signatures, the manipulation, the strategic pattern of trust built and violated. I explained how his company was a front, how the shell businesses were used to funnel stolen funds, how he used relationships as currency. I spoke for nearly 2 hours, laying out each piece like I was building a wall around him, brick by brick, and when I finished, there was nothing left for his attorney to say. In the weeks that followed, Daniel's defense tried to shift blame onto the system, onto financial institutions, onto the victims themselves. They hinted at consensual involvement, at carelessness, but the documents didn't lie, the bank records didn't lie, and neither did you. Outside the courtroom, reporters began circling. They had gotten wind of the case, a high-profile scam with romantic overtones, a successful lawyer turned whistleblower turned key witness. It was the kind of story that writes itself. But I didn't speak to anyone, not yet, because this wasn't about headlines, this was about consequences. At home, I kept to myself. I stopped checking social media, stopped answering messages. I didn't want support or sympathy, I wanted justice, and I knew that required passion. Night, I sat in my living room staring at the evidence board I had constructed over months: photos, maps, bank statements, faces, and names, all interconnected. Daniel's entire empire dismantled by someone he had once kissed goodnight and promised forever. It wasn't vengeance I felt then, it was release, the final untangling of a knot I had carried for far too long. When the trial began, the courtroom was packed. Prosecutors laid out their case methodically, and when it was time, I returned to the stand for the second time and answered every question calmly, clearly. The defense tried to trip me up, implied that I had been emotionally unstable, that I had acted out of spite, but their tactics felt hollow, flat, because I wasn't just a witness, I was the architect of this. Reconningy had watched Daniel lie to my face in the kitchen we shared, had watched him forge papers on the couch where we watched movies. I had kissed a criminal and fed him breakfast, and I had come out of it stronger, sharper. When the prosecution rested their case, Daniel's team requested a plea bargain. Behind closed doors, they tried to cut their losses, offered partial restitution in exchange for reduced charges. The prosecutors consulted me, and I said no, he didn't deserve convenience, he deserved process, he deserved exposure, he deserved to sit in that courtroom every day and hear his crimes spoken aloud with the full weight of evidence behind them. The trial dragged on for weeks, but the outcome became clearer with every passing day. Testimony after testimony piled up, and the image of The perfect boyfriend shattered under the weight of documents signed in the dark, lies whispered over wine, and fake LLCs built on stolen love. When the jury returned the verdict, the room held its breath. Guilty on all counts: fraud, identity theft, wire fraud, bank fraud, conspiracy. Sat motionless, but I saw his jaw twitch, his hands curl just slightly as the words echoed through the room. He didn't smile, I didn't cry, I just sat still and let the truth settle in. After the hearing, as I walked out of the courthouse, cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions. Some asked how it felt, others asked if I was proud, but I didn't respond because it wasn't about pride, it was about reclaiming something that had been taken. He went home that night and opened a bottle of wine, not to celebrate, but to breathe for the first time in months. Really breathe. I lit a candle, sat on my balcony, and watched the city below, alive and indifferent. Daniel had walked into my life and thought he had found a mark, but what he had found was a mirror, and in that mirror he saw every lie he had ever told staring back at him through the eyes of someone who had once loved him and now simply saw him for what he was: not a genius, not a mastermind, just another coward who mistook kindness for weakness and underestimated a woman who had the law in her blood and fire in her bones. There is a strange kind of silence that comes after justice is served, not the silence of shock or sorrow, but the kind that settles deep within your chest, a quiet that feels earned, like the end of a long battle fought in the shadows, a silence that doesn't ask for applause, only understanding and breath. I sat in that silence the night the jury found Daniel guilty, not triumphant, not relieved, just still, as if the storm inside me had finally passed and left behind something calm and bereaved. Media ran with the story. Headlines painted me as the brilliant lawyer, scorned, betrayed, but victorious, the woman who took down a con artist using his own tactics against him. They called me brave, fierce, ruthless. I didn't feel like any of those things. I just felt tired, not defeated, just emptied, like I had poured every part of myself into something that had finally ended, and now I didn't know what to do with the space left behind. The federal prosecutors sent follow-up notices. There would be restitution hearings, sentencing appearances, press inquiries. I handled it all with the same precision. Always had. I gave them what they needed. I signed what was required. I showed up in court and spoke when asked, but each step felt like the echo of something I had already lived through, like walking through the ruins of a house you no longer recognize. Daniel was sentenced to 17 years. The judge called his actions calculated, cruel, and without remorse. He didn't look at me during sentencing. He stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, unmoving, like a man still trying to pretend he hadn't already lost. After the final hearing, I walked outside and paused on the courthouse steps. I looked out at the street, at the people passing by, at the flashes of traffic lights and the rustling leaves. It felt like the world was returning to normal, like this chapter that had consumed me was finally closing. I didn't feel the need to speak to reporters or answer questions. I simply walked away slowly, with the heels of my shoes clicking like punctuation against the stone back at my apartment. I stood in the doorway for a long time. I had cleaned out most of his things weeks ago, but the space still remembered him, the way trauma leaves fingerprints even after the blood is gone. The couch where we sat, the bed where he slept, the kitchen where he kissed my neck and lied with his hands in the sink. I knew I couldn't stay there, so I packed quietly, took only what I needed, and moved into a smaller place on the other side of the city, something temporary, something neutral, a space that held no memories and demanded nothing of me. The windows faced west, the light was softer and the silence felt gentler, not like grief, but like possibility. Started rebuilding slowly, not just financially, but emotionally, professionally. I took freelance legal work, low-pressure cases, contract reviews, small firm consultations. I didn't want to return to courtrooms, not yet. I needed to find out who I was without the constant pressure of being exceptional. Needed to know if there was a version of me that existed outside of survival. Therapy helped, not because it offered answers, but because it gave me space to ask better questions. It helped me understand how I had missed the signs, how trust had been turned against me, not because I was weak, but because I was willing to believe in good, and how that wasn't something I should be ashamed of. He started walking every morning, headphones and whirled out, watching the sunrise above buildings I used to sprint through on my way to depositions. I read books, I cooked slow meals, I called My mother more often. We didn't talk about what happened, she just told me about her garden, about her neighbors, about the weather, and somehow that grounded me more than anything else. On afternoon months later, I ran into a woman at a bookstore who had also testified against Daniel. We had only exchanged a few words during the trial, but now we stood in front of each other, eyes clear, back straight, survivors. She smiled and said, "I heard you moved on." I said yes, and meant it. We didn't say anything else, just nodded in quiet understanding and parted ways. It was a new thought about love, sometimes not with longing but curiosity. Would I ever let someone in again? Would I ever share my kitchen, my bed, my trust? I didn't know, but the thought didn't scare me anymore, because now I knew what to look for, what to question, what to protect. I knew that kindness and intelligence could coexist, that softness wasn't stupidity, and that strength wasn't always loud. Daniel had taken from me, but he had also taught me something, not by wisdom but by contrast. He had shown me the cost of silence and the power of clarity, the danger of blind trust and the necessity of sharp intuition. He had broken something in me, yes, but he had also forced me to rebuild it on stronger ground. One night, I sat down and opened a blank document on my laptop. I didn't know what I was going to write, only that I needed to write something, not for court, not for evidence, not for anyone else, but for me. I wrote the truth, not the details of the case, but the emotional map of what I had survived, the doubts, the weight, the unraveling, the repair. I wrote until the words became rhythm, and the rhythm became peace. And when I finished, I closed the laptop and exhaled, not with pain or exhaustion, but with a strange kind of contentment, the kind that comes from knowing you faced something monstrous and did not let it define you. Naomi was not the woman who had been used or tricked or deceived. Naomi was the woman who saw through it and chose to fight. Naomi was the woman who made silence into strategy and strategy into justice. The verdict had been delivered in the courtroom, but the real verdict was mine to give, and I had given it, not with fury but with truth, not with revenge but with resolution. I am not broken, I am not Bateri Amawake, am free. Thank you for listening to my story with me. Don't forget to follow and subscribe for more revenge, scam, and betrayal stories.